eyes. Tonight, we tiptoe across the cold stone floors of a forgotten medieval village, where shadows flicker on the walls and whispers carry farther than you'd like. You duck under a low wooden beam, heart quietly thudding as your bare feet brush against straw. The candle in your hand crackles. You're here for answers. Curious, wide-eyed, maybe a little nervous. What was sex really like in the Middle Ages? Well, you probably won't survive this. Not emotionally, anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, post your location and the current time in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're falling asleep from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You crouch low as you pass a cottage window, careful not to alert the chickens roosting nearby. Inside, a couple sleeps beneath a patchy linen sheet. A child stirs near their feet. Another person, a cousin, a neighbor, is curled up by the hearth, snoring softly. Welcome to the average medieval sleeping arrangement. Tight quarters, no privacy, and definitely no soundproofing. You assume the people of the past must have had romantic lives as modest and restrained as their diets. But the truth? People have always been people. Even with shared beds, icy drafts, and the constant threat of rats, desire didn't just curl up and die in the cold. You crawl inside and lie down on a straw mattress that crinkles like dry parchment. Lice tickle your shoulder. You try not to scratch. Sex was a very present part of life, sometimes loud, sometimes hushed, often heard by others, and rarely behind closed doors, because, well, there were no real doors. And those walls? Paper-thin timber, often shared by multiple families. If you moaned too loud, you weren't being seductive, you were just being rude. But here's the funny part. Medieval people weren't necessarily more modest than us. In fact, many didn't even have a word for privacy. The idea of closing a door to do your thing just wasn't baked into daily life. So they got used to it. You would too, eventually. In fact, some historical documents from manor courts include actual complaints from neighbors who could hear things they really didn't want to. One scribe from 1348 rather delicately described a dispute in which a woman accused her upstairs tenant of grunting like a pig. No follow-up charges were filed, but a lot of awkward eye contact probably followed. That said, the poor weren't the only ones living in a shared audio reality. Even wealthier nobles faced awkward setups. Bedrooms were often used for business meetings, servant naps, and sometimes, just for fun, public childbirth. You turn your head on a rough linen pillow and hear footsteps above you. Is someone coming down? Is it a lover, or a parent, or maybe a wandering goat? All three are possible. There's no central heating here. You're huddled under furs. Your toes are freezing. You wonder, how on earth did anyone feel in the mood under these conditions? And yet, they did. Frequently. Historians still argue whether the intense birth rates of the era came from sheer lack of contraception, societal expectations, or a surprisingly high libido despite the medieval climate. But the numbers don't lie. People kept making more people. That's not to say everything was romantic. Far from it. Marriage was mostly about property and alliances. Affection was secondary. And if you were female, your consent was usually optional. In fact, church law for much of the Middle Ages allowed for a marriage to be valid even if only one person agreed. Just one. Convenient, huh? Still, some couples made it work, and some records show tenderness between spouses that genuinely warms the heart. A man in York left behind a will in 1422, calling his wife his dearest friend and the joy of his days. You sigh. Finally, a little love in the gloom. Now back to the gloom. There's no lube, no heating pads, no candles that smell like vanilla and ambition. If you want romance, you make it yourself, usually with a song, a glance, or in some cases, a single roasted onion. Yes, really, don't ask. It's Section 10 stuff. Even bedding wasn't necessarily private. In inns or peasant homes, you might share your mattress with strangers, travelers, or local gossip magnates. That one guy with a hacking cough, he's sleeping right next to you. And no, he won't be quiet during your moment of passion. Still, you roll over and close your eyes, trying to imagine it, the way someone might whisper in your ear behind that hanging wool curtain, knowing full well that everyone could probably hear. There's something oddly thrilling about it. Less Netflix and chill, more Norman tapestry. The idea of intimacy and try in the Middle Ages wasn't tied to scented bathwater or rose petals. It was tied to necessity, to closeness, and to stolen moments in a very crowded world. Quirky fact time. Some towns actually had local ordinances about noise at night, not to keep people safe, but to keep bedroom sounds down. One village in what is now Belgium even posted fines for loud expressions of delight past sunset. Yes, that kind of delight. And here's a little image for your dreams. Some medieval towns had shared bathhouses and sleeping halls. Imagine drifting off next to someone who just told you about their lice problem. You'd either become soulmates or develop a sudden urge to sleep standing up. Still, love found a way. Because even in this scratchy, cold, snore-filled, goat-adjacent world, you hear someone's soft giggle in the dark, and it makes you smile. You stir gently in the straw, a little groggy, as the early morning light begins to peek through the slatted shutters. There's a clinking noise nearby, metal on wood. You sit up, blinking, and there it is. The infamous object of lore, the chastity belt. At least you think it is. But the more you look at it, the more it seems like a practical joke involving kitchen tools and terrible fashion sense. A rusted iron undergarment, full of hinges and absurdly placed locks. It looks more like something to roast a chicken in than anything anyone would actually wear under a gown. And here's the twist. They probably didn't. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were ever genuinely used, or whether they were exaggerated symbols of male paranoia and 19th century museum marketing. Most of the medieval belts we see today date from the Renaissance, or later. Some even appear to be satirical inventions from Victorian times, meant to mock the prudishness of past eras while being, ironically, just as obsessed with controlling sex. But the myth endures, and that tells you something. You gently pick up the belt, wondering what it would be like to wear one. The answer? Horrifying. Hygiene was already on thin ice in the 1300s. Adding metal to your most personal areas wouldn't exactly help. Not to mention walking, or sitting, or existing. Still, it's the idea of it that stuck. A woman locked up, protected by iron will, an actual iron, waiting for her noble husband to return from the Crusades. Never mind that said husband was probably off misbehaving in foreign bathhouses. The double standards had an iron grip, too. You glance around the room. The belt's just one piece of the puzzle. There are scrolls warning women to guard their honor, wooden carvings showing demons punishing impure lovers, and dusty sermons stacked high with guilt. Shame was the real chastity belt, invisible but tight. Sex in medieval times wasn't just a physical act, it was an anxious one, wrapped in the cloak of morality and social fear, especially if you were a woman. There were constant reminders that your body wasn't really your own. It belonged to your father until you were married, and then it belonged to your husband. Occasionally, it belonged to a judge or a priest, depending on what drama unfolded. Oh, and here's a fun fact to curl your toes. In parts of 13th century France, it was legally permissible for a man to beat his wife if she refused him sex without just cause. What counts as just? Good question. Historians still argue whether a headache counted. You walk toward the hearth, stepping over a pile of boots. A soft dress is folded over a stool nearby. It's not lacy or seductive. It's wool, itchy, and thick enough to stop a dagger. But medieval couples didn't need Victoria's Secret. They had curiosity, proximity, and sometimes a bit of wine. Speaking of which, wine helped. In many parts of Europe, spiced wine and mead were considered gentle aphrodisiacs, just enough to warm the body and quiet the mind. You might not be able to lock away desire, but you could smother it with fermented berries. But let's not pretend men didn't face pressure too. There were sermons for them as well, warning of eternal damnation for lustful thoughts, frequent self-pleasure, or even dreaming about someone other than your wife. Some monks recommended sleeping with a cold iron rod next to your legs at night. You know, just to calm things down if things got too excited. No, really, a cold rod. Imagine waking up in the dark, trying to fumble for that. That's not exactly romantic. Then again, romance wasn't really the point. Control was. Control over the body, over temptation, over women, over peasants, over impulses. But that control only worked in theory. In reality, people found loopholes. They always do. One document from 1413 tells of a baker's daughter in York who refused her betrothed the honor of modest delay. Translation: they got busy before marriage. The town gossip spread faster than wildfire, but no one was punished. Why? That's the part they don't show everyone else in movies. The slow, quiet rebellion. People slipping out at dusk, giggling behind hedges, carving hearts into trees, and sometimes sneaking into each other's beds while the rest of the household snored. And chastity? Well, it was less a virtue and more a negotiation. Even the church, who officially condemned all sex outside of marriage, ended up giving penance that ranged from a few prayers to, well, slightly more prayers. As long as you repented, you were usually off the hook. Except if you were caught a lot. Then you got the stocks. Or worse, public shaming. One fringe punishment involved walking through town with a wooden sign describing your crimes, while villagers snickered or gasped. Imagine doing a walk of shame with an actual signboard strapped to your back. Spooned a widow without consent. Medieval cancel culture was brutal. And yet, despite all the fear, restriction, and rust, desire didn't go away. You feel it in the air here, even now. The longing, the secret smiles, the knowing glances by candlelight. That belt on the table? It was probably never worn, but the fear it represented? That was very real. As you run a finger along its cool surface, You imagine how many lives were shaped by trying to avoid shame rather than find joy, by being afraid to feel, afraid to move, afraid to want. You step back from the hearth and let the scene dissolve, slipping softly back into your straw bed, the metal still gleaming faintly in the corner of your eye. Don't worry, you don't have to wear it. The sun is a little higher now, streaming through the shutters in long golden fingers. You stretch and blink, still wrapped in the quiet scratch of woolen blankets. You hear faint chanting in the distance, soft Latin syllables drifting through the morning mist. A monastery isn't far. The bells toll. Someone's praying. But behind those stone walls, in those cold gray cells, things are far less silent than they seem. You lace your boots and begin walking, past the low houses and bakers' carts, toward the looming abbey on the hill. Its arches are grand. Its silence? Heavy. You slip through the side entrance, your breath catching in your chest. The scent of old incense still lingers, but there's another scent too. Something earthy, human even. Warm. Monks and nuns were sworn to celibacy, of course. You've probably heard that. No sex, no marriage, no impure thoughts. Just prayer, discipline, and the occasional turn tending vegetables or copying manuscripts. But real life? Always a bit messier. You pad through the cloistered hallways and into the scriptorium, where a young monk scratches ink onto parchment. His cheeks are flushed, his eyes too wide. He glances up when he notices you, and quickly drops his gaze. It's easy to forget that these weren't ageless saints. They were young people, often forced into religious life by family arrangements, inheritance rules, or poverty. Many took their vows before they really knew what desire even felt like. And once they did know, let's just say, not everyone stayed pure. Historians still argue whether the frequency of forbidden affairs was the fault of the system, or simply proof that human nature always finds a crack to slip through. But records show that even the most holy places were home to very earthly behavior. You peek into the library and spot a shelf of old volumes. One of them is open to a marginalia illustration, a little cartoon right there in the margins, of a monk chasing a nun with something clearly not a sermon in his hand. Medieval monks were serious about their god, but they also doodled like bored high schoolers. One mainstream account comes from 14th century Italy, where a nun named Sister Benedetta claimed to have visions of Christ. Investigators eventually discovered that the visions were more like midnight visits from a fellow nun, and the ecstatic revelations? Very physical. She was quietly removed from the convent, which is medieval for don't ask, don't tell. You keep walking through the abbey gardens. The flowers are blooming, and two novices tend to the beds, whispering too quietly to be overheard. But the closeness, the tension, is obvious. Here's the thing. Monasteries and convents were not only filled with celibate people, they were often the only same-sex spaces where intimacy could naturally grow. Not just sexually, but emotionally. Tenderness, support, physical comfort. These weren't dry, desolate places. They were often the most human. And this brings us to the scrolls. You climb a narrow stairwell into the archives. Dust thickens in your nostrils. Shelves groan under the weight of handwritten books. Among the chants and rules, you find something a little different. Erotic poetry. Not just hidden in the margins. Some of it was copied quite formally, as if it deserved to be preserved. Adoring lines written from nun to nun. One even ends with, Though God calls me, I still yearn for the curve of your cheek in candlelight. Romance, even in robes. Now, this isn't to say everyone in religious life was sneaking around. Many truly lived their vows. But the institution was flawed. Powerful abbots fathered children. Bishops kept mistresses. Entire convents were disbanded after scandals. Some monasteries even gained reputations, ironically, as places where noble women could get away with more behind high walls than at home. And if you were caught, well, it depended. Sometimes you'd be exiled, other times just reassigned. The punishment was more about keeping up appearances than moral outrage. After all, the church had its own skeletons, and closets large enough to hide them in. A quirky tidbit for you. In the 12th century, there was a rule issued forbidding monks from kissing boys in the cloister, which really makes you wonder what was happening to inspire that specific guideline. You walk past a stained glass window, its colors glowing like melted jewels. The figure of a saint gazes down serenely, but you can't help noticing the slight smirk in his eyes. You wonder if he too had once been young, cloistered, and curious. The abbey bells toll again. The echo runs through the walls like a ripple. Time to leave. As you exit the monastery and step into the sunlight, you reflect on what you've just felt. The mix of repression and desire. The strange beauty of it. The fact that even in a world of strict vows, silence, and shadowed cloisters, warmth found its way in. Maybe especially there. Because in a world so focused on denying the body, every small touch meant something bigger. Every glance lingered. Every sigh echoed in the stone. You walk back down the hill, passing pilgrims and merchants, the distant hum of prayer fading behind you. And though no one speaks of it openly, you know now, sex, love, and longing never stayed locked behind stone walls. You follow a dirt path along the edge of a meadow, the grass cool beneath your boots, morning dew brushing your ankles. The village lies quiet behind you, and the abbey's bell is now just a faint echo. Out here, away from prying eyes and prouder sermons, things begin to feel different. There's a hut nestled at the edge of the trees, smoke curling from its roof, bundles of dried herbs tied to the door. You've arrived at the home of someone the villagers both fear and secretly visit, the local wise woman, or, depending on the gossip, the witch. You knock gently and step inside. The air smells like sage and something stronger. Maybe clove? Maybe goat sweat? You're not sure. She eyes you from across the room, bent over a wooden bowl. She's grinding something between stone, murmuring under her breath. A little pinch of root here, a splash of something red there. The potion swirls like storm clouds in a puddle. You ask what she's making? She looks you dead in the eye and says, love. But not the poetic kind, the physical kind. Lust, hunger, the ache behind the ribs. People came to her for more than just wart cures and fertility charms. They came for attraction, pleasure, and sometimes revenge. You sit by the hearth as she explains how one girl asked for a potion to make her husband stop wandering into the neighbor's bed. Another came hoping to woo the blacksmith's apprentice, whose hair smelled like freshly poured ale. One man, this one's your favorite, wanted something to make his own wife find him interesting again. Poor soul. These remedies weren't just folk tales. They were serious business. Recipes included things like dried rabbit hearts, powdered mandrake root, crushed ants, and even a dash of goat urine. For staying power, apparently. Gross, but weirdly committed. Were they effective? Debatable. But people believed. Historians still argue whether medieval love potions actually worked through psychosomatic suggestion, or if they were just clever pretexts for having courage. Basically, medieval confidence boosters wrapped in mysticism. One mainstream record from a 15th century court trial details how a woman was accused of giving her neighbor a brew for bed thirst. Yes, bed thirst. No, you won't find that in modern pharmacies. The trial didn't result in execution, just a hefty fine and a lot of sideways glances for the next year. You sip something the wise woman offers. Don't ask what's in it, and glance at the shelves. Bottles of amber liquid shimmer in the firelight. One is labeled simply, "For dreaming." Another reads, "For seduction, but gently." And this is where things get strange. Because once you step outside rationality, past priests and parchment, you land in the murky world of superstition. Out here, sex and magic often walk hand in hand. Want someone to love you? You might bury an apple under their bed. Want to stop your husband's blood into his soup? Yes, really. A quirky tidbit. Some believed wearing a dried frog in a small bag around your neck could keep your lover faithful. That's quite a leap of faith. Others swore by astrology. If Venus was in the wrong house, your bedroom would remain tragically quiet. Better wait until the stars aligned. Literally. Medieval astrologers made bank drawing up bedroom compatibility charts, and not just for nobles. You lean closer to the hearth. The wise woman shows you a scroll. It's written in Latin and decorated with weird little stars. One page describes a ritual involving roses, honey, and a mirror. She tells you it's for summoning a dream of your true love. But if done wrong, it could summon something far worse. You laugh. She doesn't. And not everyone found it charming. Church officials regularly warned against love magic. To them, it wasn't just silly. It was dangerous. It bypassed God's will, which meant it was flirting with the devil. Literally. There are court records where using a love spell was counted as an act of heresy. Some women, and men, were tortured for it. Imagine getting hauled in front of the Inquisition for lighting a romantic candle at the wrong time. Still, people kept coming. You feel it even now, sitting on this fur-padded stool. That quiet hope, that ache for connection. Maybe they didn't understand chemistry or hormones, but they understood longing. The wise woman leans in close. "Want to know the most powerful spell?" she asks. You nod. "Attention," she whispers. Real, focused, undivided attention. The kind people never give anymore. That's what makes someone feel wanted. You blink, suddenly very aware of your own heartbeat. You thank her and step back into the light, the smells of moss and fire smoke clinging to your clothes. The sun is climbing. Birds are louder now. And for all the goat eyes and powdered roots, you know the truth. Magic was never really in the ingredients. It was in the ritual, the time you took, the intention, the breath you held while someone looked at you a little too long. Maybe we're still casting love spells, just with emojis and playlists instead of dried frogs. But still, next time you cook soup for someone, maybe don't ask where the broth came from, just in case. You head back toward the heart of the village now, weaving through muddy lanes and low stone fences. A rooster screeches far too confidently for this hour, and a cart lurches past you, piled high with hay. And something else. Was that a pair of boots poking out? Someone's hitching a nap under the straw again. You pass one house, then another, and begin to notice a pattern. The houses lean into each other like old friends, not just metaphorically, literally. They share walls, windows, and even sleeping space. You duck into one, just for a moment, don't worry, and find yourself in a single-room home, barely wide enough to stretch your arms. There's a fire pit at the center, smoke curling lazily toward a small opening in the roof. A bench lines the wall. A rough table stands beside a wooden cradle. And then there's the bed. Calling it a bed might be generous. It's a pile of straw, linen, maybe a fur blanket if you're lucky. And right now, it's occupied by two adults, a toddler, a sleepy grandfather, and, yes, a dog. Possibly three. Welcome to the medieval family mattress. You tiptoe across the room, trying not to wake anyone. But one of the dogs opens a lazy eye. The toddler starts to stir. You freeze. Sharing a bed was normal, expected, and totally unavoidable for most medieval people. There weren't enough rooms or resources to sleep separately. And this meant a lot of interesting situations. Need to be intimate with your spouse? You did your best to wait until everyone else was snoring. Didn't want witnesses? Tough luck. Either learn to be very quiet or accept that a few extra ears, maybe even floppy ones, might be in the room. Some parents even kept their children in the same bed, well into adolescence. That wasn't strange. What was strange to them was the idea that sleep should be private. The more the merrier, especially in winter, when body heat was literally life-saving. Historians still argue whether this setup made intimacy more stressful or just turned sex into something less secretive, less sacred, and far more practical. But it definitely shaped how people approached relationships. You glance around. Everything in this house is multi-purpose. The bed is also where you sit during the day. It's where you eat if you're sick. It's where you give birth. It's where you die. But for all the chaos, there's a certain closeness here. A kind of raw, constant proximity that forges bonds through necessity. This was love. Medieval style. Cluttered, noisy, itchy, and warmed by the breath of the entire family. Livestock really did share the space. A quirky little fact. In especially poor households, goats or chickens might sleep at the foot of the bed, not just for warmth, but because the barn was too small or non-existent. Imagine trying to be romantic while a goat bleats at your feet. That's not ambiance. That's an audience. Still, it didn't stop people. Even in cramped homes like this, couples carved out micro moments. A soft whisper, a shared smile across the table, a touch of the hand as the others looked away. Sometimes, couples would hang a curtain around the bed, if they were lucky enough to afford one. This wasn't about style. It was about creating just one space in the world where you could pretend to be alone, even if the room was full. You step behind one now, tugging the worn wool slightly to the side. The air smells of hay, sweat, and soot. It's not glamorous, but it's real. Intimacy wasn't driven by aesthetics. It was driven by survival, by partnership, and by a kind of endurance that's hard to imagine in our cushy modern lives. In this room, love wasn't just emotional. It was logistical. A mainstream record from 14th century England describes a wife petitioning for her husband to build a small alcove for them to retire at night with less shame. Less shame. That's all she asked for. Not privacy, not romance, just less shame. And here's a fun twist. Some couples didn't even own the mattress they used. In certain communal houses, beds were shared across families. Imagine climbing in at the end of your day to the same mattress the neighbor used last night with his chatty new wife. Yep. There were even cases of bed rotation. When guests would stay, one couple would give up their spot and rotate sleeping arrangements. Hospitality was important. Your spot in bed? Not sacred, but despite the messiness, because of it maybe, there was a kind of grounding honesty. Life was short. Life was hard. And when you crawled into that shared pile of warmth, wrapped in smoke and straw, with someone's hand brushing yours in the dark, that was your cathedral. Sex wasn't about mood lighting and Barry White music. It was about whatever you could carve out from the noise, the work, and the endless presence of everyone you knew. A quirky fringe habit? Some households had what was known as a bundling board, a literal plank laid down the middle of the bed to separate courting couples. The idea was to allow closeness without too much closeness. Spoiler alert, it rarely worked. You press your palm against the wooden wall, feeling the grain. You can hear someone breathing in the next house. That's how thin it is. No secrets, no silence, no solitude. But maybe that's the point. In a world where everything was shared, space, sleep, smells, connection wasn't something you earned. It was something you were born into. Love happened not in spite of it, but because of it. You step back outside, the door creaking behind you, and breathe in the crisp morning air. You suddenly appreciate your own bed more than ever, but you also carry with you a strange tenderness for these crowded lives, pressed close, warmed by each other, finding space for affection in the smallest, most chaotic corners. You make your way out of the village proper now, following a worn footpath that winds between barley fields and low stone fences. The noise of the blacksmith's hammer fades, and the soft rustle of wind in the trees takes over. You're heading toward the woods, not for solitude, but for secrecy. Because when you didn't have a private bed, or even a bedroom, and you really didn't want the goats watching, the forest was the next best thing. You duck under a branch, brushing past the ferns, and the canopy closes above like a cathedral roof. Dappled sunlight filters through, and suddenly the world feels more hushed, more forgiving. This is where lovers came when they couldn't risk being seen or heard at home. Among the moss and mushrooms, pressed between tree roots and whispers, medieval people found the one thing they lacked elsewhere: space. Real, blessed space. You crouch beside a hollow tree and imagine them. Young lovers, nervous, giggling, shivering in the morning chill. Maybe it was a secret affair, or maybe just a moment of escape from too many roommates. But in the forest, they could pretend they were alone in the world. This wasn't just fantasy either. Some of the oldest love songs from the medieval period describe lovers meeting beneath the hawthorn, or where the oaks bend. Nature wasn't just scenery, it was a co-conspirator, a soft accomplice to trysts both tender and taboo. But nature also came with risks. You step over a patch of mushrooms and remember, medieval people feared the woods too. It was the place of wolves, witches, and things that went very much bump in the night. And yet, people still came. Because desire is bolder whether these secret outdoor meetings were more about romance or desperation. But scrolls and folk tales suggest both. From nobles to peasants, sneaking off into the trees was a tradition as old as the forest itself. Speaking of nobles, did they do this too? Yes. Oh, yes. While peasants might have to dodge roots and brambles, nobles had hunting lodges, little hideaways in the woods where the rich could pretend they were rugged while still having wine, servants, and suspiciously large feather beds. Think of it as medieval glamping, with less electricity and more accidental children. There are records of noblewomen being discovered in remote gardens with visiting knights. One famously scandalous French duchess claimed to take long walks to improve her constitution. What she was actually doing? Improving her knight's mood. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some monasteries even had to build fences around nearby woods because too many people were sneaking off to use them as makeshift romantic getaways. One irate abbot wrote, "The trees do not bless the sins they shade." Clearly, he'd been peeking. You kneel beside a stream now. The water gurgles quietly, and a bird flits overhead. The whole world feels like it's holding its breath. You imagine two lovers here, whispering, holding each other, trying not to laugh too loud. No goats snoring. No mother-in-law 3 feet away, just trees, wind, and maybe a rabbit or two as silent witnesses. And what about protection, you ask? Well, let's just say the options were rustic. Animal intestines were sometimes used as rudimentary condoms, cleaned, dried, and tied with a string. Sexy? Not even a little. But effective? Occasionally. It was more common among the rich, though, since the poor couldn't afford to waste potential stew ingredients on bedroom safety. Still, even the poor had their methods. Some used herbal mixtures, like pennyroyal or Queen Anne's lace, taken as teas to prevent pregnancy. Were they reliable? Not entirely. Historians still argue whether the efficacy of these herbs was real or just hopeful folklore. But the effort? That was very real. Desire in the woods wasn't just about romance. It was about risk. Getting caught could mean anything from a slap on the wrist to being dragged before the local manor court. One man, in 1398, was fined for being found in a compromised state near the orchard hedge. That's court speak for pants down. Yet, they kept going back. Because in the woods, for a little while, you could feel free. Not just from the people watching, but from the weight of expectation. No one here was telling you to marry, to behave, to be good. You could just be. And even today, in modern romances, something lingers of that forest energy, that longing to slip away, just for a moment, just the two of you, under trees too tall to judge. You rise and brush off your knees. The path curves back toward the village now, but you pause for one last look. The wind moves the branches like waves. You can almost hear laughter, a whispered name, the breath between a kiss. Out here, love wasn't a luxury. It was a risk, a need, a wild thing with dirty boots and leaves in its hair. And just for a moment, you think maybe it's still hiding here, somewhere behind that hawthorn bush, waiting. You've followed the winding road back from the woods, your cloak brushing against wild flowers and dry branches. Now, the village is alive again. Chickens scatter. Children shriek with laughter. Someone is arguing over a cabbage price in the distance. And ahead, just beyond the bustle, you spot something peculiar. It's a wedding procession. Not the grand, flowing kind you might imagine with golden crowns and harp music. This is messier, louder. There's a goat tied with a ribbon, and a drunk uncle already singing. You step aside as the bride walks past in a gown that looks more like a recycled tablecloth, her cheeks flushed and her expression complicated. Weddings in medieval times weren't the stuff of fairy tales. They were contracts, strategic arrangements involving livestock, dowries, and alliances. But they also came with one of the juiciest and most controversial concepts of the age, jus primi noctis. You've heard of it. The supposed right of the first night. The idea that a local lord could legally sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night before her husband got the chance. Romantic? Not in the slightest. But was it real? Historians still argue whether this custom actually happened, or if it was more of a myth, used to smear powerful men or dramatize medieval oppression. There's no consistent legal record of it being enforced, but the idea itself was real enough to haunt people's imaginations and their fears. You drift toward the manor hall, imagining the rumors that swirled every time a lord took an interest in a new bride. Did he ask for her presence? Or was it just understood? If the family owed debts, or if the village was in need, the custom wasn't formally written into law. Power had its own rules, and sometimes a wink was worse than a signature. A mainstream case comes from 14th century Brittany, where a nobleman was accused of laying claim to 3 wedding beds in one season. The records are vague, but the whispers weren't. He was fined, not for the act, but for causing disturbance of the peace, which tells you everything you need to know about priorities. You lean against a fence and watch the bride and groom enter their small home. Inside, guests are already piling in. Some carry candles. Others carry strong-smelling cheese. Everyone is loud. And yes, they'll be staying long after the couple is trying to, well, consummate. You grimace a little. There's no honeymoon suite, no locked door. In many medieval communities, the consummation was a public matter. Not the act itself, thankfully, but the confirmation of it. In some places, the newlyweds would be escorted to their bed by family members who would throw blessings, and sometimes breadcrumbs, onto the sheets. One quirky custom even involved dipping the groom's toes in wine to ensure future fertility. Don't ask how that's supposed to work. No one knows. In more elite households, the bedding ceremony could be an actual public event. Courtiers would watch the couple get into bed, offer a few jokes or prayers, then politely leave the room. But not far enough that they couldn't hear what came next. Imagine trying to perform under pressure while your uncle is snoring 10 feet away and someone's cousin is still chewing loudly on a turnip. Privacy was not the goal. Proof was. Because once a marriage was consummated, it was binding. No backing out, no annulments. Just endless mornings of shared breath and whatever version of breakfast existed when you had no coffee. You peek through a window now. The newlyweds sit awkwardly on their bed while an aunt adjusts the blanket. Someone hands them a small cup, probably mead or ale, and winks. They sip. A child yawns beside the hearth. There's absolutely nothing sexy about this. But later, when the fire dims and the guests finally wander home, something might shift. The noise will fade. The candles will flicker. And if the couple is lucky, if they actually like each other, maybe they'll find something sweet in the silence. Because even in this rigid, public, performative ritual, there's room for something softer. Not always, but sometimes. You step away from the window and pass a neighbor hanging up laundry, plain wool shirts, and what you suspect are yesterday's underthings. She smiles at you and mutters something about a good match at least. You nod. Love wasn't always part of the package, but neither was trauma. Many couples grew fond of each other. Partnership evolved from cooperation, plowing together, raising children, surviving winters. Affection grew like moss, slow, soft, and persistent. But power could easily disrupt that. Some lords did abuse their authority, and not just sexually. A fringe case from 13th century Scotland tells of a nobleman who reserved the right to sleep under the same roof as any new bride, just to ensure no evil spirits visited. That's the creepiest sleepover invite you've ever heard. Whether or not he did more is lost to history. But the fear, that lingered. And the myth of Jus Primae Noctis endured because it symbolized something bigger. The helplessness many people felt. The knowledge that even your most private moments weren't really yours. Still, people resisted. One German town reportedly staged a mock ceremony where villagers kidnapped a noble's effigy and dunked it in the river to protest the alleged custom. Petty, symbolic, and very satisfying. You walk back toward the square as night creeps in again. The wedding guests are tipsy now, singing badly and stepping over sleeping dogs. Somewhere behind the curtain, the new couple is fumbling with laces and linen, trying to pretend no one is listening. They're not alone. But then again, they never were. You wake before dawn this time, the air thick with anticipation and chimney smoke. Something's different today. The village is buzzing, even in the early light. You step outside and hear low drums, distant chants, and the sound of metal? It's coming from the outskirts, the traveling camp that just rolled in last night. You follow the noise and stumble onto a sight you didn't quite expect. Tents lined in a crooked half circle. Painted canvas flapping in the breeze. A pig roasting on a spit. And in the center, a stage, makeshift, creaky, and surrounded by wide-eyed villagers. This is no ordinary market day. This is an entertainment troupe. Jugglers, dancers, puppeteers, and, of course, the flirtatious performers, known for stirring more than just laughter. You settle near the edge of the crowd and watch as a woman steps onto the stage. Her dress is red, not crimson or velvet, but the kind of red that dares people. Then twice, her scarf catching the air like flame. She winks. And just like that, you've entered the world of public performance and sexual spectacle. The side of medieval life that was loud, messy, and too vivid for polite company. The performers weren't just here to amuse. They brought with them a curious cocktail of humor, scandal, and desire. Their dances were often suggestive, their jokes riddled with innuendo, and their songs? Let's just say you won't hear them in a cathedral. One bawdy ballad from 14th century France, titled The Miller's Daughter's Night, involves a mix-up with bed linens, a suspiciously long ladder, and a farmer who really should have knocked first. But performers weren't all giggles and charm. They walked a tightrope between fascination and moral danger. The church routinely condemned traveling entertainers, claiming their songs stirred carnal thoughts and debased the soul. Historians still argue whether these critiques were rooted in genuine concern or jealousy, since these troupes could draw bigger crowds than Sunday Mass. You watch the dancer toss her scarf toward a blacksmith. The man blushes, laughs, and tries not to spill his drink. Everyone's eyes are on her, but you sense that beneath the performance lies something sharper: agency. Unlike most women in medieval towns, these entertainers, sometimes called Goliardic girls, camp followers, or tavern women, had unusual freedom. They traveled, earned money, chose partners, and sometimes even ran their own crews. Of course, this freedom came at a price. They were branded as loose, dangerous, even demonic. Respectability was out of reach, but autonomy? That was something they grasped with both hands. You wander toward a smaller tent behind the stage, its flap open just enough to glimpse a mirror propped against a barrel. Inside, the red-dressed dancer is removing bangles, humming to herself. You cough gently, and she turns with a smirk. She tells you she used to be a servant in a bishop's household, until she decided to run. Now, she says, she earns more in a night than she ever did in a month. Sure, she gets called names, but she also gets to leave when she wants, eat what she pleases, and dance for herself, not just for the crowd. And yes, sometimes she chooses to share her bed, but on her terms. A scandal to some, a miracle to others. You glance at a painted wooden sign hanging beside her mirror. It reads, "Don't touch unless invited." Director, timeless. A quirky fact for you. Some medieval entertainers carried carved badges in the shape of hearts, arrows, or rather anatomically specific vegetables. These weren't random decorations. They were signals, open invitations, inside jokes, or bold rejections. Medieval emojis, basically, but far bolder. Outside the tent, a puppeteer begins a show that makes even the pigs stop chewing. It's a crude comedy involving a noblewoman, a sailor, and a suspiciously mobile chamber pot. Children giggle. Elders groan. One friar nearby crosses himself twice. This performance art, filled with double meanings and exaggerated gestures, was one of the few public spaces where sexual themes could be laughed about, talked about, acknowledged. Not behind stone walls, not in whispered guilt, but right here in the dirt, under the sun, with the whole village watching. Of course, not everyone approved. Records show that in some towns, performers were required to register with the local bishop or leave by sundown. One town even had a bell rung whenever dancers arrived to warn respectable folk to stay indoors. Naturally, most ignored the bell. But the line between entertainer and outcast was thin, especially for women. If you danced a little too close to a nobleman, you were branded a temptress. If you refused him, a heretic. And if he touched you without permission, well, let's just say the crowd would likely blame the sparkle in your eyes rather than his wandering hands. Still, the troops endured, because they gave people something they rarely got: a glimpse of freedom, not just sexual, but emotional. The chance to laugh about desire instead of hide from it. The chance to see someone move with joy, purpose, and just enough scandal to feel alive. You step back toward the road as the sun rises higher. The crowd claps. The red dress twirls one last time. Coins clatter into baskets. And somewhere in the back row, two teenagers are holding hands a little tighter than before. It's not a palace. It's not a chapel. But maybe this ragged stage under the sky is the most honest love story behind you as you return to the village's quieter edge, where the alleys are narrower, the voices softer, and the windows shuttered even during daylight. This is the part of town people pretend not to think about, but they do, often. You turn a corner and see it. A modest house with faded red paint on the door. No sign hangs above it, but the meaning is clear. This is a brothel, Or if you're trying to sound proper, a stew house. The term makes it sound like a kitchen, which is honestly pretty misleading, unless you count simmering tension as soup. Inside, the space is dim. Candles flicker. A woman in a loose linen dress is polishing a goblet with a cloth that's seen better days. She doesn't look surprised to see you. In fact, she barely glances up. New or just curious? She asks without missing a beat. You pause, because you're here to understand, not to participate. And what you're about to learn is more layered than the gossip might suggest. Medieval brothels were both reviled and regulated. Towns needed them, but didn't want to admit it. So, they existed in this legal twilight, tolerated, taxed, and conveniently ignored by people who publicly scorned them but privately visited. One mainstream example? In 14th century London, brothels on Bankside were officially licensed by the bishop. That's right. Religious authorities managing houses of pleasure. Historians still argue whether this was an attempt to control immorality or just a lucrative side hustle cloaked in moral hand-wringing. The woman gestures you inside, past a threadbare curtain, into the common room. It's not luxurious. A wooden bench, a jug of wine, a lute missing 2 strings. But there's something here. Laughter, low conversation, eyes that say we see you and we've seen worse. You meet another woman, older, stern, with clever hands and a sharp smile. She's the madam, the keeper of order. She explains that girls arrive here for all kinds of reasons: poverty, family rejection, escape from abusive marriages, or simply the lack of better options. Not all chose this life, but many stayed by choice, because in the brothel, they could earn money, form bonds, and navigate society on their own terms, imperfect as those terms were. Quirky tidbit: some brothels offered loyalty discounts to repeat customers, a literal punch card for pleasure. Every 10th visit's a free song, one madam joked in her ledger. You sit for a moment as the madam pours a small cup of something strong. She talks business, not desire. Prices, schedules, rules, no violence, no underage clients, no forcing. The women support each other. It's not perfect, but it's safer than the street, and safer than many marriages, she mutters. You ask about the church. She rolls her eyes. Yes, brothels were considered sinful, but most towns preferred a controlled sin over chaotic temptation. Better in the stew than in the pew, she says, laughing at her own joke. Still, there were consequences: public shame, legal fines, occasional raids. And yet, brothels kept coming back. You pass a dressing room, scarves, makeup, perfume bottles with barely a drop left. One woman adjusts her hair in the reflection of a dented mirror, humming softly. She used to be a midwife, she says, until a nobleman's scandal made her unhireable. Now she survives here. And sometimes she even feels seen. She tells you some clients just want to talk. Some cry. Some just want to be held. Sex might be the draw, but humanity is the currency. You hear stories, like the man who brought his wife's favorite ribbon, begging a worker to tie it in her hair so he could pretend she still loved him. Or the woman who brought books and read aloud for coin, because that's what her regulars wanted. The sound of someone who listened. Historians still argue whether brothels offered freedom or merely exploited desperation. The truth is probably both. They were survival wrapped in scandal, sanctuary and shadow, a place where women could take back a sliver of control or lose it completely. You rise and thank the madam. She hands you a small token, a carved wooden charm in the shape of a fox. For luck, she says, or mischief, either one. You step back into the light. The sun is dipping lower. The red door closes behind you with a quiet click. The people who live here won't be written into poems. No stained glass in their honor. But in the lives they've carved out, between judgment and necessity, you see something profound. In a world where choice was a luxury, they took what choices they could. And in those choices, sometimes, they found power. You follow the sun as it begins to droop behind the hills, casting long, syrupy shadows over the village. Chickens settle. Wheels stop turning. But as the day quiets, something begins to stir inside homes that looked silent. You're invited indoors, not just to eat or warm your feet by the fire, but to witness something more private, the ritual of courting. Not the flamboyant, rose petal version, but the clumsy, sometimes awkward, often deeply meaningful act of getting to know someone under the watchful eye of their family, their neighbors, and, if you're unlucky, their goat. You step inside a modest cottage where two teenagers are sitting rigidly on opposite ends of a long bench. Between them, a mother is pretending to spin wool, but her eyes haven't left them in 20 minutes. The boy stammers a question about turnip yields. The girl giggles and tugs on her apron. Her father snores in the background, possibly fake sleeping with one eye cracked open. Welcome to bundling, medieval dating with training wheels and a chaperone. Bundling was surprisingly common, especially in Northern Europe. The idea? Allow a couple to spend the night together, fully clothed, sometimes even wrapped in separate blankets, and often divided by a wooden plank or a sewn-up sack. Nothing was supposed to happen. The goal was to talk, share space, and, if all went well, fall asleep, thinking maybe. You peek into the side room. There it is, the famed bundling board, a literal divider set between two courting souls, kind of like the original buffer pillow. Historians still argue whether bundling was a clever way to encourage intimacy without impropriety, or just a hilarious failure at abstinence. The truth? It worked for some. Others definitely got creative. A quirky little detail. Some communities allowed bundling only if the girl's feet were tied in a special knot that only her mother could undo. That's one way to build trust and sore ankles. You return to the hearth and watch as the girl finally offers the boy a piece of bread. Their fingers touch. Electricity. The mother pretends not to notice but shifts her chair half an inch closer. Subtle, but clear. And it wasn't just peasants who courted awkwardly. In noble courts, love was tangled in its own set of constraints, filled with longing glances, cryptic poetry, and painfully drawn-out waiting. A young nobleman might spend months composing the perfect verse to impress a lady, or hire a musician to play beneath her balcony. One record from the 13th century Provence describes a knight who rode 20 miles to deliver a single line of verse carved into an apple. She bit it, rolled her eyes, and married someone else. Brutal. But these courtships had structure, rules, sometimes even judges. In courts of love, noblewomen would gather to debate romantic dilemmas, like whether a kiss stolen at dusk was more meaningful than one freely given at dawn. Real cases, real arguments, likely lots of sighing. Back in the cottage, you overhear the mother mutter, "Well, at least he bathes." A glowing endorsement. Because let's be honest, Hygiene was not romance's best friend. Courtship sometimes meant enduring bad breath, mud-caked boots, and questionable beard choices. If you fell in love, it wasn't just with charm, it was with resilience. Still, these small acts mattered. A favor tied to a sleeve, a song hummed under the breath, a glance across the well. And yes, there were those who broke the rules entirely. Some lovers arranged midnight meetings, climbed out windows, or carved coded messages into bread crusts. A fringe example? One girl in 15th century Italy reportedly baked secret letters into pies for her suitor, disguised as fig seeds. Risky and delicious. But for most, it was slow, patient, and filled with interference. Families controlled matches. Dowries shaped futures. Love was often tangled in the threads of survival. You watch as the boy rises to leave. He stumbles, nearly knocks over the stool, blushes crimson, and finally bows. The girl watches him go with a soft smile. No dramatic declarations, no orchestras. Just one awkward evening. And maybe the beginning of something. You step outside into the chill, your breath ghosting in front of you. Overhead, stars prick the sky. Courting may have been tangled in rules and wooden boards, but at its heart, it was still about the same thing. Hoping someone might like the real you, beneath all the lace, the mud, and the eyes watching from the corner. And maybe, just maybe, you'd get another night on the bench. The stars are brighter now, sprinkled like spilled flour across the ink-black sky. You wrap your cloak tighter and move toward the manor grounds, past low hedges and oil lamps flickering near heavy oak doors. Tonight, you're stepping into a very different world, where power wraps itself in silk and love dances behind veils of strategy. You're entering noble courtship and arranged marriages, a world of whispered alliances, political calculations, and bedrooms colder than most treaties. Inside the manor hall, the air smells of tallow candles and perfumed handkerchiefs. Servants move quietly. A musician plucks are seated stiffly across from each other, sipping wine and speaking in that overly polite tone that always hides tension. In the center of it all, a girl of 15, her face powdered, her eyes blank, and beside her, a boy not much older, fidgeting with his sleeve. They haven't spoken more than 3 words, but tonight they might be engaged, because love here is business. Marriage among the nobility wasn't about affection. It was about land, heirs, war avoidance. A union wasn't just between 2 people. It was between bloodlines. If your dowry could buy a new estate, you were valuable. If not, well, maybe you'd be shipped to a convent instead. You watch as the girl's father leans into the boy's uncle. Numbers are exchanged. Land deeds. Promises of wool shipments. The bride herself is largely background noise. Historians still argue whether noblewomen had any say in these deals, or if that was just a pretty illusion to make the whole thing feel less medieval. Some did, especially the powerful ones, but most simply followed orders, trained to see obedience as virtue. A mainstream example? Eleanor of Aquitaine was married off to the King of France at 15. She later divorced him, a scandal, and married the King of England instead. Eleanor played the system better than most, but she was the exception, not the rule. You step into a side chamber where the bride-to-be is having her corset adjusted. She's stiff, but not scared, just resigned. This is what she was born to do. Her mother, brushing down her sleeves, murmurs something about duty and patience. Then, with just a trace of emotion. It helps if he has kind eyes. In this world, desire wasn't the foundation of marriage. It was something you hoped might show up later, like good weather. Sometimes it did. Often, it didn't. You glance around the room and notice a tapestry depicting a wedding feast. The bride looks serene, the groom proud. But if you look closer, you see the servant slipping a love note under a plate. The real stories were always between the stitches. And not all noble marriages were cold. Some warmed over time. Two people thrown together by maps and money could still learn to laugh, to touch, to become more than strategy. But others? Not so much. A fringe example from 15th century Hungary tells of a noble woman who secretly paid her chambermaid to dress as her at night, so she could avoid her husband's advances and spend time reading poetry instead. Smart? Yes. Sustainable? Not really. You head back to the hall and observe the couple again. The boy finally speaks. She nods politely. It's not passion, but it's something. A beginning, perhaps. A spark flickering behind a wall of expectation. And yet, outside the formalities, something different stirs. In the servants' corridor, two maids whisper in the dark. One hands the other a folded piece of cloth. Inside, a pressed flower, a stolen glance, a memory. They smile. Quick, quiet, dangerous. Because love, when denied, finds other ways. You learn that many nobles found affection outside their marriages. Affairs were common, expected even. There were rules, of course, unspoken codes, discretion, secrecy. Poets were paid in wine and silence to immortalize forbidden glances and accidental touches at feasts. A quirky tidbit. Noble women sometimes trained their parrots to repeat romantic phrases sent by their lovers. "I miss you," squawked from a birdcage, was both adorable and very plausible deniability. But even these small rebellions had limits. Get caught, and the price could be severe, especially for women. A man might be scolded. A woman? Banished. Or worse. Still, the yearning didn't stop. Behind all the silk and titles were real hearts. Hungry ones. Some broke. Some hardened. A few, rarely, managed to bloom. You step outside again, letting the cold air bite at your face. Behind you, the door closes. A contract is signed. A future is sealed. Maybe love will come. Maybe it won't. But in the world of noble courtship, feelings were optional. Alliances were everything. And yet, even in the stiffest ballroom, a glance can linger a moment too long. A fingertip can brush against another. And in that sliver of silence, something real might begin, despite it all. It's late now. Most hearths have dimmed. The ale has gone flat. You drift through quiet lanes, the cobblestones cold beneath your feet, until a thin trail of light catches your eye, coming from a small stone building nestled behind the village chapel. No, it's not a confessional. It's something more unusual. You open the door slowly and step into a room lined with herbs, scrolls, candles, and, curiously, small woven dolls with exaggerated features. At the center sits an older woman with silver hair tied in a braid, her fingers working through a bowl of dried lavender, also known in some parts as a wise woman or cunning woman. And tonight, you're going to learn how medieval people tried to understand and control desire. You settle on a stool as she hums softly, tossing leaves into a steaming pot. She looks at you, not with suspicion, but with the calm of someone who has seen everything. She tells you that love is a sickness, that longing is a fever, and that, luckily, there are herbs for both. She isn't wrong. One mainstream fact: medieval people genuinely believed in love potions. They didn't see them as superstition. They saw them as science. After all, if rosemary cured headaches, why couldn't a mix of cinnamon, rose petals, and crushed pearls make someone fall in love? You lean closer as she opens a leather-bound book. Inside are recipes, some for fertility, others for stamina. One, she warns, is for when a man loses interest during winter. That one smells suspiciously of garlic and wine. But love magic wasn't just about potions. It was also symbolic, filled with rituals, charms, and rituals that ranged from sweet to downright bizarre. A fringe example? One love spell from the 13th century Germany involved writing your crush's name on a communion wafer and placing it under your tongue during Sunday Mass. Effective? Debatable? Blasphemous? Absolutely. Historians still argue whether these acts were considered innocent folk traditions or borderline heresy. The old woman chuckles and shows you her collection of love tokens: carved bones, braided threads, beads wrapped in parchment. She says each one carries a story of hope, heartbreak, or plain old lust. And she's not the only one in the business. You learn that both men and women sought out these magical aids. A lovesick nobleman might spend a small fortune for a charm to soften a maiden's heart. A jealous wife could slip a loyalty herb into her husband's mead, usually made of mugwort or vervain. Did it work? Maybe. Or maybe he just got sick and stayed home more. A quirky tidbit. There were also anti-love spells designed to drive people apart. One involved burying a locket under a pigsty while cursing your rival's name. Not very subtle, but hey, revenge had its place. You ask the healer whether she believes in all this. She shrugs. Sometimes, belief is the strongest ingredient. You watch as she lights a red candle and traces her finger through ash. She speaks a few soft words, something between prayer and poetry, and explains that love needs space, time, a little chaos, but also boundaries. This isn't manipulation, she insists. It's navigation. In a world where marriages were arranged, choices were limited, and hearts were often ignored, magic offered an illusion of control. You sip a warm herbal tea she hands you, laced with honey, mint, and something else you can't quite name. It's calming, sweet. You don't feel bewitched, just comforted. But not all magic was cozy. In darker corners of medieval Europe, love potions were feared. Authorities cracked down on women who sold them. In some regions, being caught with a venom of the heart could get you imprisoned, or worse. Yet, people still sought them out, secretly, desperately, because love has never obeyed rules. Not then, not now. You glance at a small cloth doll hanging by the window. Two tiny figures stitched together, their arms intertwined. The healer says someone brought it here last week. Left it without a note. That happens often. People seeking love, or escape, or maybe just a kind face who'll listen. You thank her as she hands you a small pouch of dried herbs. Just for sleep, she says. No strings attached. But as you turn to leave, she calls after you. If you ever do want to win a heart, she says with a wink, start with clean boots, warm bread, and silence when needed. That's stronger than any spell. Outside, the air is colder now. A breeze picks up, carrying the scent of thyme and old wood smoke. You realize that even in a world of arranged marriages, public shaming, and overcrowded bedrooms, people were still reaching, hoping, trying to carve out love in their own quiet ways, even if that meant sneaking potions past the priest, and maybe, just maybe, believing a little magic could tip fate in their favor. The village is utterly still now, save for the faint crunch of your boots on frosty dirt. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barks once, then gives up. But you're not heading home just yet. Tonight, you're invited to step behind the veil, into a space where reality and fantasy blur, and where private minds wove desires into parchment and paint. You duck beneath a crooked wooden arch and find yourself in a candlelit scriptorium. Not the grand monastery type, but a smaller, quieter study belonging to a curious scholar with a scandalous collection. And yes, tonight you'll be learning about medieval erotic art and literature, the secret world that proves, without a doubt, that even monks covered in old scrolls and books with cracked leather spines. On the wall, a worn tapestry showing what looks like a knight, wrestling with a goose. Strange, and yet, somehow, fitting. The scholar welcomes you with a grin. He's been waiting to show someone this collection for years, and you seem like the right mix of intrigued and sleepy. He pulls out a manuscript, illuminated with care, lined in gold, and smack in the corner, a naked man hiding behind a bush, holding something absolutely not PG-13. You blink. This, he explains, is a marginalia, those little doodles drawn in the margins of religious or philosophical texts by bored, rebellious, or possibly drunk scribes. Some are absurd. Some are poetic. Some are very anatomically ambitious. A mainstream fact, many monasteries produced books that blended religious devotion with unexpected bursts of humor and desire. It wasn't uncommon to find a passage about the Virgin Mary decorated with a rabbit jousting a snail, or a monk chasing a naked woman through a tree. Were they jokes? Warnings? Secret dreams? Historians still argue whether these images were pure satire or a way to explore forbidden thoughts without consequences. You flip another page. This one contains a love poem, handwritten in Latin and riddled with metaphors so thick you'd need a shovel. But read carefully, and you catch it. Your gaze is like warm milk on the fire, threatening to boil. Okay, now we're getting somewhere. Love literature in the Middle Ages was an art form. Courtly love poems, risque ballads, even medical texts with suggestive illustrations. And yes, much of it was passed around quietly, person to person, like the world's slowest underground newsletter. The scholar shows you a parchment containing a 13th century poem about a man who falls in love with a baker's daughter because of how she needs. It gets progressively more flower-based and progressively more unprintable. Quirky tidbit. In parts of France and Italy, young nobles would send coded love letters, folded in elaborate shapes, like swans, hearts, or in one case, a pair of tiny underpants made of parchment. Symbolism was alive and well, and it wasn't just men writing. Women, especially nuns, contributed to the canon of erotic expression in subtle, poetic ways. One nun wrote a devotional prayer that many now interpret as a metaphor for intense longing, emotional, spiritual, and physical. This surprises you, but it shouldn't. Nuns had minds and hearts like anyone else. And behind monastery walls, the absence of men didn't mean the absence of yearning. One fringe example? A set of 12th century German manuscripts written by a nun named Herad of Landsberg includes allegorical drawings of female bodies entwined with vines and fire. Interpret that how you will. You lean over a pile of love charms, pressed leaves, worn rings, and tokens slipped between pages centuries ago. The scholar admits some were found in the bindings of old books, hidden by their owners, forgotten until the spine cracked open hundreds of years later. And then there were the manuals. The scholar raises an eyebrow, reaches under the desk, and pulls out a thick tome that looks like it hasn't seen daylight in centuries. He opens to a page that reads, plainly, De Quietu Hominum, on the union of humans. You brace yourself. It's not exactly a Kama Sutra, but it does include illustrations of, shall we say, interpersonal geometry. Some are accompanied by advice. One diagram encourages readers to avoid windy rooms, lest cold interrupt the mood. Another recommends onions and wine before bed. You're skeptical. Historians still debate whether such manuals were instructional, satirical, or just curiosity projects gone too far. Some were likely used by physicians. Others, probably just for lonely winter nights. You smile as you close the book. None of this is new. People have always sought to make sense of their feelings, whether through poetry, prayer, drawing, or quietly scribbled jokes in the margins of a very serious sermon. The scholar thanks you, presses a small parchment into your palm, an excerpt from an old love letter. Your silence is the shadow I chase through the garden. Melodramatic? Absolutely. But charming too. You step outside, back into the night. The world feels a little softer now. Knowing that even in cold stone halls, by flickering candlelight, someone once took the time to ink their longing into parchment. That even in a world of arranged marriages and rigid roles, the heart still found its pen. And maybe somewhere, a tired monk still dreams in metaphors. You walk a little slower now, the village asleep beneath a sky draped in velvet. But before you rest, there's one last doorway to pass through, one rarely spoken of out loud, even in whispers. A place where secrets took root and consequences lingered far beyond us toward the edge of the forest, where a small hut leans wearily beneath ivy and shadows. It's here you learn what happened after the desire, after the love notes and stolen glances, the marriages and the nights warmed by potions or passion. Tonight, you're stepping into the world of pregnancy, shame, and secrecy in medieval times. Inside, the room is quiet, too quiet. A single oil lamp casts an amber glow across clay pots and worn linens. A woman sits hunched over a cradle that is painfully empty. She doesn't look up. You already know, not all stories ended in fairy tale endings. Some ended here, because while the medieval world spoke often of marriage, it had very little to say about what happened when things didn't go according to plan. A pregnancy out of wedlock wasn't just frowned upon. It could destroy a life. For most unmarried women, discovering they were pregnant meant hiding, or running, or pleading for mercy before a council of old men with ink-stained hands and little empathy. Sometimes they were forced to name the father. Other times, punished with him. But more often, they bore the burden alone. One mainstream fact: in 13th century England, church courts dealt with hundreds of fornication cases every year. The penalties ranged from public whipping to forced marriage to long-term penance in a convent. A baby born without a ring could mean ruin. You glance at a shelf where small wooden tokens are lined up, tiny shoes, charms, ribbons tied into fading knots, keepsakes of infants never claimed or never named. And this was the quiet tragedy. For many women, childbirth itself was a gamble. Without modern medicine, it was dangerous, sometimes fatal. Midwives did their best, Folk remedies offered hope, but the odds weren't great, and for those who labored in secret, the danger doubled. A fringe case from 15th century Bohemia tells of a young servant who, after being abandoned by her master, gave birth alone in a barn. She was later tried not for the child's fate, but for hiding her shame from the village. Historians still argue whether her punishment was about justice or preserving public image. And yet, not every story ended in sorrow. Some villages quietly supported their own. Mothers helped daughters. Midwives took risks. One French town even had a secret network of women who passed the bundle, a phrase that meant smuggling abandoned infants to childless homes. You step closer to the woman by the cradle. Her eyes are glassy, but her hands move with the memory of care, adjusting blankets, smoothing nothing. She's waiting for something that's no longer coming. Or maybe she just needs someone to sit beside her for a while, because loss doesn't vanish. It lingers in the corners of rooms and the folds of old dresses. You notice a piece of parchment tucked under a jar of herbs. It's a birth charm, written in looping Latin. The ink has faded, but you can still read the last line. May she live, though the world forgets her. You step outside for air, and a neighbor quickly pulls her shawl tighter, nodding in solemn recognition. She doesn't ask questions. She just places a hand on your shoulder, and you both stand there for a moment, listening to the wind push through the trees. Of course, not all pregnancies were hidden. Within marriage, childbirth was celebrated. Painful, yes, but also purposeful. Mothers earned status. Fathers boasted. Yet, even then, the risks were immense. 1 in every 3 women might not survive their childbearing years. A quirky tidbit. Some women drank a concoction of vinegar and crushed coral before labor, believing it would cool the womb. Midwives also sometimes whispered prayers into the left ear of a laboring woman, because it was thought that demons entered from the right. You wonder how many fears and hopes and whispered names passed through rooms like this one. How many loves ended in silence or in a lullaby sung to no one? Because sex, in the medieval world, always carried weight. Emotional, social, and deeply spiritual. And for women especially, the consequences could shape an entire life. You look back toward the hut one last time. A faint candle still glows. And though you'll never know her full story, you'll remember that not all romance ends in poetry. Some ends are quiet, heavy, but they matter just as much. You begin walking back toward the village square, the sky slowly preparing for dawn. Behind you, the forest sighs. Ahead, the church bell waits for morning. Love was not always fair. It was not always gentle, but it was real. And sometimes, surviving it was the bravest act of all. You find yourself back near the heart of the village now, near the old stone well, where stories have a habit of gathering like fallen leaves. It's almost morning. The sky is melting from deep navy into soft gray, and birds, oblivious to history, are beginning to stretch their wings. But before the world wakes up, there's one last love, desire, scandal, secrecy. But now, you lean into the quiet hush of what came after it all. The long, tender, often invisible truth of companionship, age, and memory. You pass a weathered man sitting outside a cottage, a hound curled at his feet. He nods at you, eyes crinkling like old parchment. Inside, you're invited to sit near a hearth where an older woman rocks gently in a wooden chair, humming a tune that has no beginning and no real end. She glances at you and smiles, the kind that doesn't need to be warm. It just is. Because what comes after the bloom of youth and all those chaotic passions is something far more difficult to describe, and perhaps more beautiful than all the rest combined. In the medieval world, aging wasn't glamorous. It meant bad knees, missing teeth, and the distinct smell of liniment oil. But it also meant stories, wisdom, and love that had thickened like old stew. No longer spicy, but rich, comforting, slow. One mainstream fact: in some parts of Europe, widows over a certain age were granted more freedom than any other women. They could manage property, remarry on their own terms, or choose solitude. They were seen as less threatening, but also, strangely, more respected. They had outlived the system. You look at the woman's fingers, bent, knotted, but still weaving a basket with practiced ease. Her husband of 40 years dozes nearby, his mouth open, softly snoring like a medieval trumpet. She chuckles. "You think love disappears?" she asks. "It just forgets how to stand up quickly." They met when they were 16. She worked in the kitchen. He delivered firewood. He spilled something, probably soup, and apologized so many times she agreed to walk with him out of sheer annoyance. And they never really stopped walking. You ask her what kept them going. "He makes the bed," she says. "Badly. But he tries." And I laugh. And that's enough. No ballads were written about them, no potions brewed, but they knew each other's silences like scripture. And in a world that often measured love in drama, theirs was measured in spoons, shared cloaks, and a small wooden box of letters they never mailed. You peek at one. The ink is faded. It simply says, "You are still my morning." Not everyone got that ending. Many grew old alone, by choice or by fate. Some never married. Some lost loves too soon. But aging, in its strange mercy, softened those edges. Passion turned to memory, memory into story. A fringe tale passed down in this village speaks of two old shepherds who lived side by side for decades, never speaking beyond a grunt. When one died, the other walked into the hills and wasn't seen again until the next spring, when his walking stick was found planted upright beside a blooming violet. Historians still argue whether they were friends, lovers, or simply two souls who understood each other's presence better than words ever could. And yes, even at the twilight of life, desire didn't vanish. It just quieted. One quirky fact: medieval medical texts included love remedies for the elderly, usually involving figs, cloves, and rather optimistic stretching instructions. Did they work? Probably not. But hope, after all, has no age limit. You hear the rooster crow. The village begins to stir. A baby cries somewhere. A cartwheel groans. Life, imperfect and relentless, resumes. The woman reaches for your hand. "Remember this," she says. "The stories they tell you about love, they're just the first chapters. The best parts are too quiet to write down." And with that, she turns back to her basket and her snoring husband and the day. You step out into the first warmth of dawn, the air kissed with dew and chimney smoke. It smells like bread rising. And now, one last walk through the sleeping village, where all the noise has settled into stillness. The shutters are drawn, the lamps have gone out, and in this moment, this soft, silken quiet, everything that came before begins to blur like a dream. The passion, the pain, the giggles under quilts, the secrets whispered beneath orchard trees, the herbs ground into potions, the awkward glances, the marriages arranged by land and livestock, the love letters hidden in flour sacks, all of it. woven into the slow, sacred rhythm of being human. Your footsteps echo gently on the cobblestones, softened by morning mist. A baker lights his oven in the distance, and smoke curls lazily into the air. A cow moos once, and then decides it's too early for effort. The village exhales. You think about the red dress twirling on the stage, the wooden charm passed from palm to palm, the old hands clasped under quilts that had seen too many winters. You think of the girls who left, the ones who stayed, and the ones who were forgotten by everyone but the stars. And somehow, it all feels okay. Not perfect, not easy, but deeply, stubbornly real. So you pull your cloak tighter, turn your face toward the soft light, and let the warmth of everything you've witnessed settle behind your eyes. Let it be heavy. Let it be tender. And when you're ready, close your eyes, friend. Let the stories rest with you now. You've earned that peace.